So now you get to hear me, folks. So I don't think I really need to introduce myself, but I will say that I've spent many, many years working for Cooperative Extension, now working for NorCal SAF, and I started out nominally as a extension forestry specialist, but really most of when I work has been in more of the area of environmental forestry, I guess you would say, and most lately really getting into the area of oak woodland. So I want to acknowledge the many, many people that have participated in my work over the last decade or so and have contributed to this presentation. All of these people have provided moral and financial assistance, technical assistance, and I've even got grabbed a few photos from some people. So and when you guys download my presentation, you guys can look at these and ponder who these people are. But I really want to thank all of these folks for helping me out over the years. So what's the background on all this? Well, all these listed things on the left there are the things that I've done over the last really almost 15 years, mainly in the Middle Sierra, and starting out with a study that Susie Coker and I did in 2001, where we looked at the effects of county land use management practices on oak woodland in Madera, El Dorado, and Placer County. At that point, I met Lauren Clark from Placer County, and that began a long-term relationship. Lauren has been preparing a NCCP, HCP, the Placer County Conservation Plan, and I've contributed to that plan over the past 5 years or so, initially doing some work on CEQA analysis for development impacts on oak woodland and then wildfire management. On the bottom right, you'll see some white screens overlain on an air photo. That's work that we did to estimate the so-called development footprint of rural residential development, the development footprint being a basis for estimating the impacts of development in the oak woodlands in Placer County, and from that estimating take. From there, we went into oak woodland restoration. Would that have a role in the Placer County Conservation Plan? And then most recently, I've been part of a committee looking at ways to prioritize oak restoration in Placer County. So why restoration? Why are we worried about this? I mean, from what you're saying, the oaks are doing fine, and they're likely to do better in the future. Well, that's not truly the case in some of the oaks. So we have ongoing impacts from development, wildfire. We have impaired regeneration. We have insects and disease affecting oaks. Community succession is an interesting thing. I just went to a Board of Forestry meeting where they were talking about the overtopping of Gary oak woodlands in the north coast by conifers and the loss of that species. So thousands of acres are lost to these causes every year. FRAP, the Forest Resource Assessment Program of CAL FIRE, in the 2010 assessment estimated that more than 700,000 acres of oak woodland would be at risk from development in the Sierra Nevada and the Southern California. Wildfires affecting oak woodland in Placer County are shown in this graphic. Major losses have occurred in Southern California, the Cedar Fire, and all those other fires in San Diego County and elsewhere, and in the Sierra foothills. We've got existing and newly introduced pathogens and insects. Of course, we're all familiar with sudden oak disease, sudden oak, SOD. I'm not even sure what the D stands for anymore. But we also have things like the gold-spotted oak borer, which affected San Diego County, but it's not confined there in terms of susceptibility of the species. So the species that are susceptible include coast live oak, canyon live oak, and California black oak. And should that gold-spotted oak borer escape from Southern California and get into those other regions, then those species could be affected by it. Dave Passavai is asking me to define what loss means with regard to fire. Well, loss can range from outright mortality to temporary setbacks where a species might come back from sprouting, but loss is a relative term. Some other causes of losses: impaired regeneration of blue oak and other oak species is pretty well documented. The Gary oak situation that I just discussed, but that's not the only oak that's being affected by succession. I mean, there's community succession is occurring everywhere in places, especially that are subject to fire suppression. We've got increased understory densities that are challenging the vigor of existing oaks and actually affecting the regeneration of oaks. So the implications of all this are habitat fragmentation, threats to long-term sustainability. That is, the species some of the species being reduced in ranges or being reduced in areal extent, and ecological reverberations, such as reduced mast crops affecting wildlife. So all of these things are reasons for why we think about oak woodland restoration. So where do we want to restore, or where are we restoring? Well, there's a whole bunch of mitigation and compensation projects that are out there. These are generally undertaken pursuant to CEQA. We have garden projects, which are basically tree planting in freeway pockets, urban lots. And then we have watershed and landscape scale projects that are generally associated with habitat conservation plans or NCCPs. And for these, my question is, what sites or locations are optimal and will provide the most benefits? And then also, in terms of the inputs we're willing to provide to encourage oak restoration, how long are we willing to wait? Some of the early work that was done by Rick Standiford and Doug McCurry on modeling blue oak growth over time shows that, we're talking about 100-year time frames to achieve mature oak woodland. So when we invest in restoration, we've got to be patient. So we have these many restoration projects, such as the Caltrans planting projects that are common in many freeway interchanges. Doug McCurry and I took a pretty long and hard look at some Caltrans projects that were done along Highway 20 mitigation projects in conjunction with the freeway improvements over there. There's a lot of work that's going on by Caltrans and by other entities, really, but these tend to be awfully expensive. So how about site selection criteria for landscape scale projects? I mean, we have several different criteria that we can use to select areas. They can be ecological, improvement of connectivity, enlargement of habitat patches, increased habitat diversity, providing critical habitat for species with special status. For example, I visited a site the other day where there's Swanson hawk present, and encouraging oak woodland restoration in an area like that's going to provide habitat for that species. And there's other endangered species and threatened species or species of special concern associated with oak woodlands. We also have physical criteria and logistical, really, criteria, such as having suitable soils and topographic landforms, sites being accessible for management, and then potentially restorable land covers. Some early work I did down in San Diego County on riparian restoration was looking at the potential for restoring riparian woodlands along San Luis Rey River. And one of the things we did right off the bat was dismiss areas that were already irreversibly committed to other land uses. I mean, first off, buying land to be restored that could potentially be developed or is zoned for development can be an extremely expensive proposition. Plus, you want to start with land where the land cover is potentially reversible to an oak woodland. So here's a picture of it's really a restoration evaluation for Western Placer County that we did. And what this shows is areas where you could do oak woodland restoration based on some of these criteria, including the presence of suitable soils, the presence of potentially convertible land cover, and proximity to existing reserves, which would facilitate management. So there's black oak, blue oak, valley oak shown here, and then also the existing reserves in Western Placer County. And so the idea is that if you take this particular pair of reserves and you look at the existing blue oak, which is in the light blue, and then you look at the potentially restorable blue oak, which is in the dark blue, and you look at the gray, which is potential black oak restoration, or the greenish yellow, which is valley oak. These are areas that meet those criteria of having some ecological significance and also being manageable in terms of land cover and access. So what do you want to restore? So how do you select a reference community based on dominant species and associated species? And there's some sources of information for that. You can have historical accounts, vegetation surveys in areas that you consider to be relatively intact or pristine. And then my favorite is the Department of Fish and Wildlife's vegetation classification, which has been done. And for those of you that aren't familiar with this, I would really encourage you to get familiar with it if you're in an area where this mapping has been done. Todd Keeler-Wolf is, an old ally of mine, provided me a lot of help in the past. The mapping that has been done by the Department of Fish and Wildlife is just an incredible source of information. Here's what that mapping looks like. It provides, in addition to mapping the polygons, it provides a great deal of information on the stand structure and the stand composition, the density, and the associated species. From this information, you can interpret what you might consider to be reference conditions for restoration. And in fact, that's what I did in Placer County, is I interpreted those data and I said, well, here's what, the density might be. Here's what the dominant species are, the associated species. And that gives you a target for restoration. So how do you do it, though? One of the main messages I have in this presentation is that there's more than one way to do oak woodland restoration. And the approaches range from those that are intensive, involving high levels of input, high costs, and along with that, relatively high certainty of success. If you think about these CEQA-based mitigation projects, basically they're compelled to achieve something within a limited time frame that says we've mitigated our impacts. Now, that in order to achieve that certainty, it means intensive effort. You can also have low input restoration practices. Low input meaning basically you work with lower levels of cost, with less certainty about your success. Maybe you're willing to accept a lower survival rate. Maybe you're willing to accept a longer time frame. And then you can go all the way to extensive restoration, which is basically just changing grazing regimes, using fencing to promote natural regeneration. Now, it's been demonstrated in earlier talks in this series, depending on natural regeneration can be problematic, particularly in years of poor mass crops and limited precipitation. I also want to make a distinction, excuse me, between restoration and enhancement. Early on in Placer County, we decided that we not only want to look at restoration, outright restoration, creating a new community, but also we want to look at how to enhance existing communities, protecting and promoting natural regeneration, implementing practices that encourage improvement of conditions or reverse ongoing impacts. And then one of my favorites, improving stand conditions to reduce risks of fire, disease, and insect attacks. So some basic references are out there, and those of you that are familiar with the Integrated Hardwood Range Program, which is unfortunately is no longer in existence, but all of the information is still there at that website that I'm showing there. And of course, McCreary's basic reference, Regenerating Rangeland Oaks in California, this is almost all you really need to know in terms of how to do it. But the question is that how to do it also is depends on how much money you got available and what really how long you're willing to wait. But there's these basic references that are out there, and you should look at that website. And also, I've posted some things on the webinar resources page so that you can take a look at those things. So you have to make some choices. If you're going to do restoration, are you going to use seedlings or are you going to use acorns? What densities are you going to plant at? Are you going to plant associated plants, not just the trees, but also the shrubs or the forbs, the herbs? Are you going to irrigate or not? Are you going to protect the plants? Are you going to do weed control? How about fertilization? And then a commitment to long-term management. The mitigation projects, sometimes they have a 3 to 5 year time frame where somebody's looking over your shoulder to make sure that the trees survive. What happens next? There needs to be a commitment to long-term management for any restoration project. We're talking about 50 to 100 year time frames. On the lower right over there, you'll see this was a well-intended project of planting acorns, and each one of, not each one, but many of the acorns were methodically dug up by what we think is ground squirrels, and the acorns are eaten. So it actually became sort of a ground squirrel feeding project. On the lower left, you'll also see a very vigorous-looking oak that this is one of Rich Marovich's projects where he's a real believer in fertilization, and that has encouraged many of his trees to get superior growth rates. So I have some examples here I want to share with you because they kind of show you what the spectrum is. This one is in Roseville, and it's courtesy of M.G. Newman, who is, I think, on board today. It's the Wood Creek East Oak Mitigation Project. This is a typical mitigation compensation project. There are 10 acres planted with seedlings at a high density, over 200 trees per acre. They use tree shelters and pre-emergent herbicides and deer repellent. There's a 3-year maintenance, including irrigation, mowing, and pest control, with 5 years of monitoring. The costs for this project were roughly $14,000 per acre. Now, we have seen costs for similar projects in Placer County ranging up to over $40,000 an acre. Caltrans projects range up to $35,000 an acre. So actually, Mr. Newman is kind of getting by on the cheap here, and he's done some really interesting things with adapting irrigation so that it's lower maintenance and lower cost. But one of the things that that's important here is that this is a project that is compulsory. Okay, this is something that had to be done because of of a development, and it's a trade-off for development. Lagoon Valley Park in Vacaville. This is courtesy of Ted Swiecki from Phytosphere, who if you haven't visited the phytosphere.com website and you're interested in oaks, you certainly should, because Ted is, the primo expert on insects and diseases affecting oaks, and also he's got a wealth of information on oak restoration, and he's even invented what's called the Vaca cages, which is it's a plant protection device. So this particular site was planted with acorns by volunteers in 1993. They planted, it's obscured for some reason, but they planted 115 sites on 5.5 acres. They protected them with exclosure cages that volunteers constructed. There's no irrigation. Survival was 50%, and that's pretty typical. I mean, in a good year, we have good precipitation. You can get survival from acorns up to 90%. The cost for the materials were $1,000 so that's what, $200 an acre, right? And you can see the results on the right. That's what it looked like before, and that's what it looked like after. And is that considered successful? I would say yes. That's a successful restoration project. A depot seedling is a seedling that's planted in a pot that's particularly long to try to accommodate the taproot on the oaks. Oh, I think Justin's going to respond to that too. The next one I have here is Placer Land Trust, and Placer Land Trust, basically like a lot of land trusts, and I've inquired with several of them, and other locations like Walnut Creek Open Space District. Their restoration projects generally involve the use of volunteers and low-input technologies. I mean, they're trying to do things cheaply. They're trying to involve the community in them. And so the plantings are typically done with acorns and donated seedlings. And according to Justin, some of the seedlings are actually grown by volunteers. Justin gives them the acorns, and they grow them, and then they plant them. They're planting low-density groves on suitable sites. They're not planting, rows of trees. They're planting at selected locations. They protect their seedlings from livestock, deer, and rodents with tubes, and this is really essential. I mean, if you're going to invest any money in oak woodland restoration, and you've got any critters that are going to affect those plantings, then you need to protect them. The tubes also reduce summer sun scald, and that's why Justin chooses to use the more opaque tubes. You'll see there's three little boxes on the photo on the left. There's three little boxes next to the tubes, and those are dry water boxes. And what is being done here is avoiding irrigation by using dry water to enhance survival, and then hopefully you're going to get a good rain. Good rains coming up when the trees are established, and that gives them a jump start. Justin's controlling competition with mulch and herbicides, and that's another essential part of restoration. Really, is controlling competition in the early years so that the trees get up to a height where they're no longer affected so much by the competition. So what are the costs for this range of restoration practices? Well, intensive restoration costs from $12,000 to $40,000 an acre. Low input restoration costs using acorns, using plant protection, probably not using installed irrigation, ranges from a few hundred to $1,000 an acre. The big cost items are plant protection, irrigation, and labor at prevailing wages. So if you can incorporate volunteers or subsidized labor into your program, then it's going to be less expensive. Your trade-offs, the more expensive, certainly there should be the higher level, higher certainty of success. You also have the time to achieve objectives and the cost. I mean, there's going to be longer, you need to have a longer time frame, and you have to have a long time perspective on these things. Oaks grow slowly, and it's going to take a while before what you do today is going to look anything like an oak woodland. So now I want to talk a little bit about enhancement. And enhancement meaning working with what you've got to try to make it better. And that can be done through protecting natural regeneration, removal of exotic species, introducing native species, and in my view, you can do a lot of enhancement through implementing fuels treatments. Those pictures on the right over there show you some typical shots of oak woodland in Placer County. And you can see that the one on the top has got a relatively dense stand on the left and a relatively open stand on the right. Is that a natural thing, or is that an artifact of land use? On the bottom, you see a relatively open stand, just clusters of trees here and there. Is that what it has always looked like? Is that an oak savanna? Or is that really an area that's been impacted by land uses? Enhancement in cases like this might mean trying to increase the density of the oaks in selected locations through these enhancement practices. But increasing the density of oaks isn't always the objective, isn't always the aim. And in some cases, what you've got is overly dense stands and thickets of oaks, which have regenerated after an initial disturbance. In the case of Placer County, some areas were cleared for orchards, and then they've gone back to oaks, and they're overly dense. So here's a case where you might want to implement treatments that would both reduce the risk and also encourage the growth of the residual trees. One such place is Hidden Falls Regional Park in Placer County, where they did thinning and pruning to reduce fuel loads. And the thinning should have the secondary benefit of increasing the health and the growth and vigor of the residual trees. They implemented this with subsidized labor. They used the con crews, and the costs for treating 110 acres were about $4,700 an acre, which is, that's a lot for a public agency, but that's the price you pay, really, because of all the administrative and planning work that goes into it. A second example that I just recently looked at, and which is bears some kind of controversy, Dry Creek Community Park, which is over by Roseville. It's a riparian area, so it's a riparian oak woodland, valley oak woodland. It had a dense understory of exotic blackberry, which was removed, which was masticated. They implemented this with subsidized labor. Now, the key to this as to whether it's enhancement or not, and there are as many people who would say it's not, is what they're going to do next. Okay, so they've removed the exotics. Now, the opportunity exists to reintroduce native shrubs and grasses to replace those exotics. They've left most of the trees, and there's some openings that could also promote natural regeneration. This is an area that's grazed, so you have to control things like future land uses like mowing, okay, which is anathema to natural regeneration. But this site actually, to me, offers a potential for enhancement. There's another site that we looked at in El Dorado County. Now, this is a case where it's private property. It was subsidized with cost share funds. And again, if the future maintenance will be crucial, I've seen stands like this that have been treated that were immediately invaded by exotics, such as French broom or Scotch broom. And because the cost share programs don't necessarily facilitate or fund the follow-up maintenance, sometimes these things are treated once and then they're sort of, everybody walks away and expects everything to be fine. But these are living, growing systems, and they need to be properly managed and attended to. So I'm just saying, really, my message on this is that fuels treatments have the potential to reduce risk and to enhance oak woodlands, but it depends on your long-term management. So the bottom line on the work with Placer County of our committee was they asked us, they said, well, what should we do? I mean, what part should oak woodland restoration play in our Placer County Conservation Plan? And this is stimulated initially by just the recognition that oak woodland restoration using intensive methods is expensive. So the recommendation we came up with were basically to emphasize the acquisition of parcels with intact oak woodland, particularly valley oak, which is, rare, and basically try to get the best that's out there. Then protect resource values, reduce the risk, and try to protect and encourage natural regeneration on parcels that you do acquire. Avoid costly restoration projects. Essentially focus on low input restoration. Focus on valley oak. Use acorns. The desired density, final density on natural stands is about 30 to 50 planting sites per acre. If you get survival in each one of those, then you'll be reaching what the reference density would be in a natural oak woodland. Avoid artificial irrigation. Install tree protection. It's essential. Control competition, and that's also important. And the cost should be less than $1,000 per acre. And so they have our recommendations, and hopefully they'll act on them. I think they've already prescribed a target for valley oak restoration of about 300 acres in the uplands, and we're quite happy with that. So with that, I'll answer any questions. I also want to announce on behalf of UC, the 7th California Oak Symposium. It's going to be in November. The call for papers was just released, so if you have some ideas on submitting a paper, you guys should contact Rick Standiford at Berkeley and tell him what you got to offer. So with that, I'll close, and I'll be happy to take any questions. Mike, are you going to cut any questions in? Or are there any?
I'm working on it. There was this one that was just inserted by Ray Moritz, so I'll put that in there.
Yeah, about sudden oak death. I'm not very well versed in sudden oak death because I haven't been working in those ecosystems on the coast. It's not an issue in the Sierra, in the foothills. As I mentioned before, cold spotted oak borer is potentially an issue, and a lot of that depends on the transport of infested firewood from region to region. To my knowledge, it hasn't gotten into the Sierra yet. But as far as sod, it's not really a problem that we're talking about here. There's a question, I think, about bishop pine. I can't really address that one.
That question is for Hugh, I do believe.
Okay, great. Okay, any other ones? Justin's been fielding my questions over in the chat box, so that's great. See if there's any more questions here. Is valley oak still in danger in California? Well, Mark, valley oak has been decimated in California, and I don't have the exact numbers. I mean, I can't tell you exactly what those numbers are, but I can tell you that most of the land that formerly had valley oak, at least in Placer County, Yuba counties, those foothill counties, most of those lands have been cleared for agriculture. And if any valley oaks exist, there's usually just a narrow gallery There are some remnant stands that I'm familiar with along Coon Creek in Placer County, but it is a species that, at least in Placer County, we recommended restoration should focus on because it is a relatively rare community in that area. It's still present in riparian areas, that's true, and it's in some areas it's been restored. For example, along the Casumnes, there's been some, the work that was done by the Nature Conservancy. But as I say, I think it's pales in relationship to what used to be there. Okay, some more questions? Best method to control unwanted individual oaks for stand density. Well, chainsaws are pretty good. If it's a sprouter like live oak, then you commonly have to follow that up with an herbicide treatment. I think that's probably what you're asking.
You want to respond to Carrie's question?
Let me see. I don't see it here. I have to move the thing down a little bit. Oh, how would you manage a site that was severely burned and the oaks are resprouting? So that well, my goodness. Let's see. Well, coppice management is the way to go, probably. They're being heavily browsed. Don't have money to put on cages. Well, you might consider in lieu of individual cages, you might consider exclosures and fencing. And I would suggest that you might want to talk to your local range advisor at Cooperative Extension to talk about how areas can be fenced to exclude deer. Rather than dealing with individual trees, dealing with the areas might be the way to go on that. But if you want to, I have valley oak sprouts in my backyard. Not sprouts, but seedlings that have come up in clumps, in groups, and I'm thinning those to try to encourage the residual ones to grow better. And that's true of coppice management, means selecting out the best one out of the group of sprouts and trying to keep that and encouraging that to grow to maturity. Cages, they're not as expensive as you might think. If it's a private property, then there's a kind of an issue. But if it's a public property, which is I'm more familiar with, sometimes you can get volunteers to construct them. So David's talking about controlling resprouting. And really, resprouting is probably best controlled with herbicides, or if you're herbicide averse, then using a chainsaw to cut them back. But they're going to keep sprouting back as long as they've got a root crown. More questions?